All right, let's jump right into this explainer. If you've ever read through the biblical narrative, you've probably stumbled on this almost bizarre mystery. Why Canaan? I mean, why was that specific spot chosen as the promised land? The text doesn't exactly give us a neat, God chose Canaan because bullet point. But when we piece together the historical and geographical clues from our source material, we find out this was never just about handing over some prime real estate. Let's dig into how this specific plot of dirt acted as a testing ground, a massive global billboard, and honestly, a miniature model for a huge redemptive master plan.
So, our story kicks off before Israel is even a blip on the radar. Listen to God's command to Abraham in Genesis 12. Go from your country to the land I will show you. Notice the sequence there? God didn't give Abraham a grand tour and then ask if he wanted to sign the lease. No, he asked for obedience first. Abraham was literally walking into fully occupied territory he didn't own a single inch of. Right out of the gate, this land was way less about geography and entirely about learning to trust the unseen.
And that brings up a really fascinating question. If you're picking out a homeland for your specially chosen people, why go with this small, highly contested strip of land? Why not just hand them the keys to a lush, incredibly wealthy, already established empire? Like Egypt? Well, the answer is actually hidden right there in the geography itself.
Which brings us to Section 1, the geographic mystery, or as we'll see, the crossroads of the ancient world.
When we take a look at the map of the ancient Near East, Canaan's placement is just absolutely brilliantly strategic. It's completely boxed in by massive superpowers. You've got Egypt down south, the mighty empires of Babylonia and Assyria to the northeast, Arabia to the southeast, and the whole Mediterranean world out west. Canaan was literally the ultimate land bridge. Armies, merchants, world-changing ideas, they constantly crossed right through this exact territory. God didn't stick his people in some isolated hidden valley. He put them on a highly visible stage. Because, let's face it, if you're going to be a witness to the nations, you absolutely have to be visible.
Moving on to Section 2, let's talk about the climate, a climate of dependence, which was totally a feature, not a bug.
See, it wasn't just the map. The actual weather was totally part of the plan. It's a brilliant study in contrast. Think about Egypt. They had the mighty Nile River. That meant predictable irrigation, massive wealth, and ultimate self-sufficiency. They basically controlled their own water supply. But Canaan, the text describes it as a land of hills and valleys that drinks water from heaven. They relied entirely on unpredictable rain. So while Egypt had the ancient equivalent of an easy button, living in Canaan meant you were constantly looking up at the sky. If it didn't rain, well, they didn't eat. The geography itself was literally engineered to prevent self-reliance.
And this really gives a whole new context to that famous phrase, a land flowing with milk and honey. It doesn't mean there were literal rivers of dairy and sugar everywhere. It's describing an ecosystem that's highly capable of sustaining agriculture, vineyards, and livestock, but completely lacking the effortless luxury of those massive river-based empires. It was a striking, intentional balance. Exactly enough blessing to reveal God's goodness, but exactly enough limitation to keep them dependent on him day in and day out.
All right, Section 3, the Wilderness Classroom. Let's look at this period of delay and preparation.
So if this land was promised to Abraham, why didn't the Israelites just march right in and take over? Why the massive historical detour? Try 400 years. That is a long time. That's how long God waited. And Genesis 15 actually tells us why. God delayed because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. See, the land was a stage for divine justice. Israel wasn't getting it right away because God was waiting patiently until the wickedness of the current inhabitants hit a tipping point. The eventual conquest was this fascinating mix of a fulfilled inheritance and delayed judgment.
But here's the kicker. Even when that 400-year wait was finally up, Israel actually reached the border of Canaan twice. The first generation got there, looked across the border, saw these massive fortified cities and giants, and basically said, nope. They rejected the whole promise out of pure fear. They turned right around. The issue wasn't the geography. The issue was faith. They proved in real time that you simply cannot enter the promised land through unbelief.
And because of that unbelief, they ended up wandering for 40 years. But we really need to completely reframe how we view this detour. The wilderness wasn't just some big punishment, it was a necessary spiritual classroom. Look at this beautifully put idea. The land was the gift. The wilderness was the preparation. If God had just handed them the gift before they were actually ready to rely on him, their own self-sufficiency would have destroyed them. That wilderness, it was shaping a nation.
Which takes us to Section 4, a stage for redemption, sacred history and future promises.
As the centuries rolled by, this physical dirt started accumulating some incredible sacred weight. Abraham built altars here. Jacob dreamed of a ladder to heaven here. But honestly, maybe the most striking detail is about burial. Even though Abraham owned practically nothing in Canaan, he was absolutely adamant about buying a burial cave for his wife Sarah. I mean, why buy a tomb in a land you don't even control? Well, it was a profound declaration. He was essentially saying, hey, I might die before seeing the promise fulfilled, but my bones are going to wait right here. It was a physical down payment on a divine covenant.
And when we zoom way out, we can see this incredible master plan unfolding across millennia. This exact piece of land became the headquarters for King David. It became the site of the Great Temple. And most importantly, thousands of years later, it became the exact geographic location for Christ's earthly ministry, his crucifixion, and the empty tomb. So long before Bethlehem, God was already deliberately setting apart this highly visible land bridge to be the permanent stage for the salvation of the entire world.
Finally, Section 5, Beyond the Map, the Living Prophecy. This brings us to the ultimate reveal of this explainer, where earthly geography transforms into this beautiful, poignant spiritual metaphor. By the later texts we're looking at, Canaan basically becomes a living prophecy. The historical path of the Israelites perfectly maps onto the universal journey of every believer. Think about it. First, slavery in Egypt, symbolizing our bondage to old habits. Second, deliverance through water. Third, navigating that difficult wilderness of preparation. And finally, stepping into a promised inheritance. The map itself literally drew a picture of the journey from bondage to freedom. Which means, at the end of the day, the land itself was never the final gift. The Israelites, who obsessed over the dirt and the borders, they missed the larger point entirely. The territory was just a shadow. It was a temporary placeholder for something infinitely greater, a permanent covenant relationship. The whole story begins by focusing on a specific geographic land, but it culminates in the establishment of a completely new spiritual kingdom.
You know, we all live somewhere between Egypt and Canaan. Just like Abraham, we often receive promises long before we ever see the visible evidence. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. When things get difficult, are you constantly looking back, wishing for the predictable security of your own Egypt? Or are you willing to give up your self-sufficiency and truly trust the wilderness preparation that leads to the true promise?